Greetings, I'm Per from Sabaton, and you are watching Sabaton History Channel, and this is Attack of the Dead Men!
Part 2.
Roughly 5 months before the deadly gas attack on Osowiec Fortress, which we covered in Part 1, and which the song is about, well, it's about the attack and the unbelievably brave defense and counterattack of the soldiers of the Russian Empire. Anyhow, 5 months before that, German meteorologists began studying the winds in front of the Ypres salient on the Western Front. Behind their lines, more than 160 tons of pressurized liquid chlorine were being stockpiled to be unleashed in one devastating attack. Then, in the early morning hours of April 22nd, 1915, in concert with an artillery bombardment, the cylinders were opened. At first, the bombardment did not cause much alarm to the Allied soldiers on Hill 60, but aside from the usual smoke and sound of the shelling, there was something different this time. A wall of greenish-yellow fog up to 2 meters high was slowly creeping towards them. It was driven by the wind and had a sweetish-chloric smell. From the rear of the lines, the officers around French General Henri Mordac could see sudden unrest and confusion in the forward positions. Soldiers of the 45th Algerian Division were suddenly standing up, crawling over the parapets, waving their arms. Men were then simply abandoning their trenches and streaming to the rear in a hurry, coughing, spitting, retching. Most were clutching their throats. Their eyes were red with pain. They were oblivious to the shells falling around them. They stumbled back or collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. As we looked to our left, we saw a thick, yellowish-green cloud veiling the sky like a cloud of vapor. We were already affected by the asphyxiating fumes. I had the impression I was looking through green glasses. At the same time, I felt the gas upon my respiratory system. It burned in my throat, caused pains in my chest, and made breathing all but impossible. I spat blood and suffered from dizziness. We all thought we were lost. General Henri Mordac. Then the British and Canadian lines beside them were hit as well. Those struck by the cloud fell unconscious and died with twisted limbs and blackened faces. The chlorine gas filled the trenches, leaving them full of men choking and gasping for breath, some foaming at the mouth, in every degree of agony and distress, incapable of offering any resistance to the advancing enemy. The Germans, on the other side, had watched, at first hesitant at what to do. Once the gas began to dissipate, though, they charged into the wide-open gap. It was thanks to the defense of the survivors of the British 15th Brigade, who held their ground in this chaos, that a large breakthrough was prevented. Of the 1st Dorsetshire, 46 men had been killed by the gas, and more than 150 more were affected, blinded or vomiting on the ground. But still, the gas-stricken men held their trench. Through determination and sheer iron will, they manned the machine guns long enough to fight off the rushing Germans until reinforcements could be brought in. Of those who are still living, very few are expected to recover. We found our dead everywhere where they had crawled to get out of the way. Hill 60, quite apart from our losses, is a terrible sight. Hundreds of bodies all over the place, terribly mutilated. A large number of our own men and a large number of Hun. Stench is awful as they cannot be buried. Never quiet enough to do that. So they lie as they fell, silent spectators of modern warfare. CMS Shepherd, 1st Dorset.
7,000 Georgia mass turned the tide of the attack and forced the enemy to turn back. And that's when the dead men are marching again.
News of the gas attack circulated immediately. The Allied press accused the Germans of committing a terrible war crime. The use of poison gas was seen as horrific, diabolical, and stood against all civilized warfare. It simply broke the rules. Okay. The Germans had pushed the gates of gas warfare wide open, but the concept of chemical warfare was not new by any means. Since ancient times, soldiers had poisoned their blades and their arrowheads with toxins. Back in 80 BC, we know that the Romans used clouds of caustic lime powder to flush out a tribe that was hiding in a cave. But the Age of Enlightenment sought to put limits on suffering during wartime. The first agreement about the prohibition of such chemical weapons dates back to 1675, when the Holy Roman Empire and France both agreed to not use poisoned bullets anymore. The Hague Convention of 1899 expanded on this agreement by prohibiting shells solely filled with asphyxiating or debilitating gases. The only dissenting vote at that time came from the American representative, the naval captain Alfred Mann. He argued that asphyxiation from gas wasn't that much different than condemning sailors to drown in the sea after their ship was hit by a torpedo. He was also backed by his government, who did not want the US to restrict itself from using a potentially war-winning weapon. Circumventing the treaty, France continued experimenting with weaponizing non-lethal gases, and were in fact the first to use gas during the Great War. Lacrimatory gas grenades were tested against fortresses to see if they could suppress small arms fire from within. They named them cartouche suffocate, suffocating cartridges. Such gas was indeed sporadically used by the French with 26mm rifle grenades in the opening month of the Great War, but the effect in the field proved inadequate. German scientists began with similar experiments during the Great Shell Shortage of autumn 1914. Many deadly chemicals were byproducts of shell production anyhow, and they thought to supplement their arsenal with them. Chemist Walter Nernst was one of the first who invented such weapons of mass effect, right? By developing the Nye shell, a mix of traditional shrapnel balls and 500 grams of non-toxic lacrimatory gas. The effects were also underwhelming. It was to be Nernst's colleague, the brilliant and future Nobel Prize-winning chemist Fritz Haber, who would go on to change the playing field. He was already critically acclaimed by the military for co-inventing an artificial nitrogen fixation process. Now, he would make an even bigger impact on the war itself. While the Allies denounced his invention as a war crime, the German press tried to elevate Haber to a national hero, one who could finally break the stalemate. But there were many German generals and scientists who condemned the use of poison gas as inhuman and dishonorable. Haber's own wife, a chemist herself, called it a perversion of science. Out of shame for her husband's invention, she committed suicide shortly after the attack on Hill 60 became public. Haber, however, felt no remorse. Just one day after her death, he left for the Eastern Front to instruct German officers in the use of his new wonder weapon. From May 1915, during the days of the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive, Haber personally oversaw the release of the lethal gas attacks. At the river Ravka on May 31st, more than 260 tons of chlorine gas from 12,000 cylinders were released against the unprotected Russian lines. This first massive cylinder attack killed approximately 6,000 soldiers in a single afternoon. Like the British and French at Ypres, the Russians were totally exposed to the lethal gas as they lacked any kind of protective equipment. A month later at Bzura, 2 Siberian regiments lost 90% of their strength to a single gas attack.
Russians won't surrender, no, striking fear to the foe, and that's when the dead men are marching again.
Historical research on the amount of German gas attacks on the Eastern Front is sadly lacking, but most scholars agree that the Russians suffered more than any other nation from the effects of gas attacks. It is estimated that 500,000 soldiers were affected by the gas, of which around 66,000 were killed. Prolonged exposure to chlorine without protection is fatal. In just a few minutes of exposure, soldiers would lose consciousness in excruciating spasms of pain as the chemicals attack the tissues of lungs, eyes, and throats. Even the inhalation of a lower dose could still kill after 30 minutes. Some afflicted died days later. Like those defenders of Osowiec Fortress, the Russian soldiers usually had no experience of gas warfare. and were simply doomed until they could come up with adequate protection. In the wake of the gas attacks, Russian General Nikolai Yanushkevich urged Tsarist command to supply the army with protective gear and, more importantly, chemical weapons of their own. The major problem in both regards was that Russia did not really have a domestic chemical industry. Most of their chemical plants had belonged to Germans, and they had closed up shop since the outbreak of the war. But what Russia did possess were brilliant scientists. By 1916, a specialized war chemical committee was formed, chaired by leading Russian chemists like Vladimir Ipatiev and Alexei Favorsky, who continued to press their government to fund adequate countermeasures. Before then, they were able to get their own chemical production running, and the first tons of liquid chlorine were produced, but still, each large-scale German gas attack caused thousands of Russian casualties. Chemist Nikolai Zelinsky made a major breakthrough experimenting in Petrograd's Triangle Rubber Factory. He outfitted a rubber helmet with Prokofiev goggles, a pair of hermetically sealed glasses. Zelinsky had also figured out that the use of carbon absorbent would intercept the deadly chemicals and added a respirator canister filled with charcoal to the mask. Altogether, he presented the first modern gas mask design of the war. However, what Russia lacked was not the expertise of its scientists, but modern production and distribution capabilities. Delays in outfitting their massive armies with new equipment were common, and each retreat or shakeup in the command structure pushed things further back. The notorious corruption and incompetence in the Tsarist bureaucracy did not help much either. On the battlefield, they had been firing back at the Germans with gas shells since autumn 1915, but it was at a disadvantage that they could hardly break. Each time they got somewhere close to drawing equal, the Germans came up with some new sort of highly toxic chemical, and the Russian chemists went back to work. When phosgene gas was the new killer on the Eastern Front, it was Russian scientists who discovered that the use of phenate hexamine was an effective blocking agent. This information saved thousands of their Western allies. But while those allies could comparatively easily mass-produce such countermeasures, the Russians could not. It was not until early 1917 that there were even sufficient gas masks available in the Russian army to withstand the German gas attacks, but by then, they had different problems. In the end, not even the strongest and most protective gas mask could prevent the soldier from being affected in some way by gas, perhaps just by fear or panic. Each time the alarm would ring, when a lookout would loudly clang pots together yelling, "Gas! Gas!" it became a race against time. Sometimes it was mere seconds that stood between life and death. No soldier could duck away from it, nor could the soldier hope to simply withstand its effects, no matter how healthy and fit he was. And when he smelled it, it might already have been too late, for then they were already dead men.
Osowiec, then and again, attack of the dead. 100 men facing the lead. Once again, 100 men strike again, die again. Osowiec, then and again, attack of the dead. 100 men facing the lead. Once again, 100 men strike again, die again.
Okay, now obviously this song was inspired by events concerning soldiers from the Imperial Russian Army, but what is your Russian connection with this song?
Yeah, okay, so originally when we released this song, it was released before Sabaton by a Russian artist called Radio Tapok,
Okay.
who we allowed to hear the song before anybody else. So he had the chance to do a cover version of it.
Okay, and did you know he was going to do that?
Yeah, and we even invited him to come down to one of our shows where he had some little filming where he was capturing, or we are capturing him in a scene where like we're trying to torture him and stuff. And he released that as a music video.
Oh, wow.
And Radio Tapok is he mainly does covers.
Okay.
He's writing some of his own songs as well, but he's mostly famous for writing cover songs of artists from Rammstein to Korn to Sabaton.
But it says harder rock and metal artists.
Yeah. More like that, yes. And he's doing it his style, and he's translating the lyrics into Russian.
Okay.
So it works for the audience in Russia very well.
That's cool.
And when we did the song and he did a cover of it, we thought it sounded awesome, and we were like, what if we one day do a crossover?
Sure.
And we went to play in Moscow, and we invited him to join us on the stage. And he came onto the stage and started to sing in Russian without any announcement, and the audience went crazy. It was an awesome moment, you know, when you are able to give a pretty cool surprise to the fans, and it works out that well. So I guess we can watch a little bit from that.
Yeah. Now, are the Russian audiences, are they often familiar with these Russian lyrics? I mean, do people sing that?
No, not really. I mean, when we are touring in Russia, a lot of our fans, they prefer the songs to be like us. I mean, they listen to us because they like us.
Yeah, sure.
But sometimes it is a cool twist to the whole thing.
Yeah.
And we saw that it was not only the people in Russia who appreciated the little thing when and it sounded awesome, and people all over got excited about it.
But now he's got him, but who does he use for his band and stuff? What about the music and stuff?
I think he has various musicians joining him on tour. I'm not sure.
And he releases whole albums or just the occasional single? Or, I mean, does he have a label or are these bootlegs or how does it work?
I guess he's releasing it. I guess he's releasing it self-released.
Okay. Well, there'll definitely be some links to you somewhere down there. Now, Per, I have to admit, I'm sorry that I attacked you earlier today. You know, I know you were just trying to do your best to get the show off to a start. If we have time, we'll shoot another beginning. But, you know, we're running so short on time that might be the only thing. We're going to have to roll with it.
And you looked fitting. I mean, you're wrapped. And why are you wrapped?
Well, because I'm dead. Obviously. No, I know you've noticed I've had this for many weeks. I haven't had this for many weeks. I've had this for 2 days, but we're shooting a bunch of episodes here in Falun where the band, they're working on some songs and new projects and new cool ideas, which you guys will hear about eventually. Some of them even here, right? No, I woke up the other morning, and I went to wash dishes, which is a bad second line for a blues song. And I went to wash dishes because I had not done that the night before. And a wine glass exploded, and it cut my hand, and I put on a Band-Aid, and then I put on another one, and then I put on another one, and another one, and I put on a fifth one, and under the 5 of them, I could still see it just filling up with blood, and I thought, okay, that's not good. So I had to go to the district nurse, and so they gave me this awesome-looking, way over-the-top bandage for far more than the cut actually deserves, you know. So now you know. So
if you were trying to drink from the glass and it exploded, you would have looked very much fitting to this specific song.
I really would have. And you know what's interesting? If I had done this a couple 100 years ago, I could have died.
True.
You know, because they had to do a lot of antiseptic stuff because it was a while before I got to the nurses because I convinced myself I didn't need to go to the nurses. So that's why I've been wearing this for the last, how many weeks? I don't know what order we're doing these. But hey, back to a more serious subject when you talked about the face and stuff like that. You know, when people think of the First World War, one of the things they do think of is gas. It's an enduring symbol of the war, which is a real shame. But since the majority of the deaths in the First World War were caused by artillery. Of active soldiers and stuff. But gas is the scary one. Because artillery, it comes and you die. The gas, you see, you know, it's hard to imagine, you know.
I guess it's also very, I mean, all the stories and the images, it can't be, it must be worse. As you said, you get shot, hopefully, for your own sake, you die quickly. Yeah. Gas, it's going to take a little while. Even
it could take years, you know. That's, and think of just the it's distasteful. I want to say, think of the balls of these guys, like literally falling apart and choking on their own lungs, but still going, all right, we got this. You know, it's a pretty heavy, it's a heavy theme, but it's a really good tribute to both the depths of horror men are capable of inflicting on each other, but also the depths of courage and bravery that men are capable of in and of themselves, you know?
And thankfully, the end of the First World War resulted in the ban of use of this.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of countries did not sign, the ban. And of course, in the 30s and in the Second World War, Japan used some chemical and biological weapons and stuff. And there was plenty of gas used by the Germans in the Second World War, although not on the front lines. Hitler had been gassed himself, so he did not use that against other soldiers. He found that distasteful. He used it on an awful lot of other people that were not soldiers, but well, we already did the final solution, which was one of the hardest hitting episodes of this series. If you haven't seen that episode, that's your homework to go and see, again, some of the horrors that man is capable of and why it's important to remember these things to be able to stand up against them before they can happen again.
True.
All right, well, that is it for today from Sabaton History.
Thanks for watching. Thank you everybody for watching, and thank you everybody for supporting. And those who don't do it, click the bell, subscribe, and become a patron. Thank you very much.